I admit it, I was wrong, and I suppose I owe several Dragon Ball Z fans an apology. See, there was a time not too long ago when I made a very bold statement that I thought was an indisputable fact. That Dragon Ball is objectively better than Dragon Ball Z when it comes to its quality as an overall story. I was convinced that the smaller scope, the pacing of its arcs, and the more tightly woven story transitions made Dragon Ball the superior series. Sure, DBZ may have cooler moments, but Dragon Ball has better setups and payoffs than its modern successor. At least, that's what I used to think. But recently, I started rewatching both series again with my wife since she'd never seen them before. And while I do still have positive feelings about Dragon Ball, I realize now how incorrect I actually was. Now, this video isn't really to bash on Dragon Ball, as many of my issues with the series are just a sign of when it was created. Instead, this video is going to talk about the well-made elements of Dragon Ball Z that sometimes get overlooked by its fans, and then comparing those to similar elements of Dragon Ball just to show how the series improved over time. So, if you want to wax nostalgic for a bit, then stick around, grab a snack, and let's talk about what made DBZ so great and why I was wrong about Dragon Ball. Before we get too deep though, I feel it necessary to point out that I am specifically referencing the anime. I have read a great deal of the Dragon Ball manga and will agree that it tends to have better pacing and may not fall into some of the criticisms I'll be mentioning here. But the manga is not the subject of this video. Anyway, let's get started. Dragon Ball is the story of a young Goku traveling the world, experiencing life outside the forest for the first time, and making friends along the way. Throughout that story, Goku is constantly getting stronger and uses his strength to protect those he cares about. And as an adventure/coming-of-age story, I'd say it does a pretty good job of establishing the world and the characters and showing their impact on Goku as he matures. You've got the happy-go-lucky protagonist, the brilliant female character, the pervy old man, and the friend who's not quite as strong as the main character, but you love them anyway. All the hallmarks of a typical shonen are here, and most of the characters get their time to show off their value as people. Well, except Yamcha. Quick side note by the way, before rewatching this, I could have sworn that Yamcha had some wins in Dragon Ball and that he had just fallen off in DBZ. But from the very beginning, Yamcha was always taking L's. He was weaker than Goku from the very first appearance, the Wolfang Fist never actually did anything, and every time he was involved in a meaningful fight, he got used as the punching bag. Well, at least he always has his confidence. But as I was saying, most of the characters in Dragon Ball, excluding Yamcha, got a chance to show who they were as people. So when DBZ leaves most of these characters in the background for most of the series, it can seem as though the personal nature of these stories has been lost in favor of action. And while that take isn't exactly wrong, upon rewatching, I think most of this stems from fan expectations differing from the intentions of the author. Unlike Dragon Ball, DBZ is not the story of Son Goku and his friends. At least that's not the only story. While Dragon Ball was a story primarily about Goku, Toriyama revealed that his intention with DBZ was not simply to continue Goku's story, but instead to transition the series to a new hero in the form of Goku's son Gohan. That's why we see so much of Gohan revealing his hidden potential throughout the series, and why the Cell Saga culminates in Gohan being the hero of the story, not Goku. So while Goku's friends are used in the series, many of them for the sake of time have been moved further into the background in order to make room for Gohan's character development. In a vacuum, this can seem like there are unexplored characters in the series, but while DBZ is a standalone show, it does still function like a sequel. There's no need to spend excessive amounts of time going into the hard work-centric mindset of Tien, or the root of Yamcha's strangely misplaced confidence, because we've already seen that in the previous series. Second side note, and I promise this isn't a Yamcha video, but I hate the fact that even in Dragon Ball, Yamcha's scar is never given an official explanation. He just disappears for training and shows up with scars. Apparently this is to show that Yamcha trained a lot, but nobody else got scars from their training. I mean, did he do it to himself with the spirit ball? Did he fall off a cliff? There's no way another human did that to him. So for all we know, he did it to himself to make himself look cool. Anyway, the point I was getting to is that while these characters are still important to the plot, they don't have a direct relationship with our focal point characters, so there's no need to show any more of them than what we get. And when we take a look at the actual character we should be following, which is Gohan, the quality of the writing is at very least comparable to the original Dragon Ball. A couple of weeks ago, while watching the final episodes of DBZ where Gohan shows up with Pan, my wife said, "Oh my gosh, it's like we're watching his entire life." And at that moment it set in that we kind of are. Unfortunately, over time, Toriyama realized that Gohan's character wasn't suitable for the role of lead protagonist, so Goku once again took over. But up until the end of the Cell Saga, for all intents and purposes, DBZ is Gohan's story. And as a result, it does a good job of highlighting the characters that are important to Gohan, even if some of Goku's friends have to take a bit of a back seat. Gohan's two closest friends, Krillin and Piccolo, are prominently featured in almost every story arc, and they stand in as the audience to comment on how much Gohan has grown since the beginning of the series. Even Vegeta, who initially begins as an antagonist and a source of fear for Gohan, eventually becomes someone with a soft spot for him. Someone who marvels as he watches Gohan's incredible potential in the battle with Cell. And then of course there's Goku, who goes from constantly trying to keep Gohan out of harm's way to throwing him under the bus. To trusting him to carry on in his place as the world's protector. When viewed as a coming-of-age story for Gohan, DBZ once again becomes a very personal story. Just one that takes place on a larger stage than Dragon Ball and with a larger cast that can't reasonably share equal screen time. There is something to be said about how the Buu Saga messes up this narrative by ultimately usurping Gohan's role and reviving Goku. But on a personal level, I don't really mind where Gohan's character ends up because even from the beginning, Gohan had more of a soft-hearted nature. One of his first lines of dialogue is about how he wants to be an orthopedic. But if it helps, we can go the way of DBZ Abridged and just pretend the Buu Saga never happened. The one area that's a bit more objectively better in DBZ though is the pacing. And this one is maybe a bit unfair to compare between the two because Dragon Ball was created so long ago. The original Dragon Ball started airing in February of 1986. Animation technology was advancing at the time, but it hadn't yet reached the levels it would start to hit in the 90s. For a simple comparison, look at the aspect ratio of Dragon Ball versus Dragon Ball Z. So the original Dragon Ball is filled with shots that linger just a little bit too long on nothing happening, and the fights, while occasionally offering some cool spectacle, are often only able to show one character at a time as opposed to some of the more comprehensive angles used in DBZ. This isn't to say that the fights in Dragon Ball aren't impactful or interesting to watch, but upon reviewing the series, there did seem to be a lot of things that just dragged on to fill screen time. Which brings us to DBZ, because even as fans, we often criticize the show for wasting time with power-up scenes. And while it does happen that characters will sometimes just stand there waiting for the enemy to power up, aside from maybe Cell's transformation, these actually don't take up that much time. Now, whether or not the characters allowing these transformations to take place made sense could be up for debate, but in terms of time wasted on transformations, I do think the criticisms are blown a bit out of proportion. As for the positives of pacing, DBZ actually has a lot, especially if you watch something like Dragon Ball Kai that removes the filler. Even though the show aired only 3 years after Dragon Ball, the increases in animation technology are immediately apparent, and it only gets better as the show ages. For example, looking at scenes of the Cell Saga side by side with the Saiyan Saga is mind-boggling to me. But even more than fancier graphics, DBZ has a greater sense of forward motion in its story than Dragon Ball. As much as I love moments like Goku playing around with Murasaki and his side mission into the demon world, sometimes it can feel like the main plot of Dragon Ball is taking a break for these moments to happen. Of course, you can argue the same for things like the Garlic Jr. saga, but most of the time in DBZ, the things you're watching on screen feel like they have at least some weight with regard to the story. So it doesn't feel so much like the story is taking a break, it's just another area of the same story being explored. And I know technically Goku dealing with the demons is part of his traveling the world to train, but it doesn't change the fact that that feels like it has no bearing on the rest of the story. Is that the same demon world that we see in Hell, or is that the demon world that Deborah rules? It's very unclear how that fits into the story at all, and it's more of a one-off moment that never has any bearing on anything else. And before anybody mentions it, the driving episode is godlike, it gets a pass. And while some fans may not really like it, the slice of life stuff for Gohan actually sets up his relationship with Videl and ties into Goten's training. But if you want to argue that there's a ton of stalling in the Buu Saga that feels like bad pacing, I won't fight you on that. A ton of moments in the Buu Saga feel like they were just looking for an excuse to keep it going when they could have reasonably ended it multiple times over. But again, boo-hoo. This section is only for one point really, because for the most part I think both Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z do build up pretty well. But I hate the Ultra Divine Water as a power-up mechanism, and I hate it for two reasons. One, because it was effectively debunked for a much cooler solution early on. When Goku first makes his way up Korin Tower and asks the magical cat for a drink of spirit water, Korin gives him the runaround, makes him climb the tower again, and also tests his character. Then, when Goku finally gets the water, he learns it was just tap water all along, and that the real way to obtain strength is through hard work and training, and constantly pushing your limits. So from there, we see Goku constantly pushing himself and trying to become stronger through training and fighting strong enemies. But then when he can't beat King Piccolo, all of a sudden the solution is a magic MacGuffin that would kill anyone else. But because Goku has some special latent power within him, the drink lets him live and multiplies his power to an unspecified level. After he drinks the spirit water, he's suddenly able to go toe-to-toe with King Piccolo. No training, no montage, no new abilities, no nothing. And it's made even worse because the one thing that would have previously been a good explanation for this is no longer true. Because in that moment, while what he might have been feeling was righteous anger, what he was planning to do is exact vengeance. And I don't know about you, but that does not sound like purity of heart to me. In all honesty, when Goku initially went after Tambourine, I thought for sure he was gonna fall straight through the Nimbus. If the water was all about testing a person's purity and judging their motivations, Goku should have failed that test. Otherwise, if the water was just for any warrior capable of stopping great evil, why was Goku the only person able to do it? Yes, I'm aware of the parallels between Dragon Ball and Journey to the West. I understand that Son Wukong was also sent on a mission to find magic water, but that doesn't explain the connection between the water and Goku for this story. Especially when you consider that at this point, Toriyama knew that Goku wasn't even an Earthling. So the idea that he was somehow the chosen one makes even less sense. The funny thing about this is that almost everything I'm saying about the Divine Water can also be said about Super Saiyan. It's a legend that gets brought up before it appears, but seems to just be a mythical MacGuffin until Goku somehow obtains it. And it also creates an insurmountable rift in power between Goku and his friends. But that's where we get into the second reason why I hate the Divine Water. Because it has literally no bearing on anything else in the story. Goku drinks the water, becomes just strong enough to defeat King Piccolo, and then immediately afterwards goes into another training arc. And that training is what makes him strong enough for the later battles, not the water. On top of that, the mystical power level obtained through the Divine Water is surpassed by every main Z fighter in the series by the middle of the Saiyan saga. Sure, I suppose it's possible that each of the Z fighters found and drank the water, but I think they would have mentioned that. So it feels like the water was literally just a shortcut to get rid of King Piccolo. Super Saiyan, on the other hand, was obtained and then was used regularly throughout the series. It was a massive jump in power, but it wasn't just a one-off technique to beat Frieza. Anyway, this video isn't supposed to bash Dragon Ball. It's to celebrate DBZ. And what better category to do that than with our last one? Now, before someone calls me out, I'm not gonna pretend that DBZ has the best fight choreography in anime. The power system of DBZ is a bit overly simple, and the fights are less intricate than something like Hunter x Hunter or even an older show like Samurai Champloo. But there are so many epic moments in Dragon Ball Z that are extremely rewatchable in my opinion. Some might criticize this show for being overstuffed with big blasts that don't kill anyone or long flurries of blows that don't end the fight. But for me, there's never been a time when I watched Gohan take out the Cell Juniors that I didn't inwardly shout, "Yes! Get them!" And watching Videl fight Spopovich puts a pit in my stomach every single time. There's a reason why middle school kids my age used to put their hands in the air and pretend the sun was a spirit bomb. The show, for all its faults, was the embodiment of cool. Plus, we were all too young to watch Yu Yu Hakusho on Adult Swim, so Dragon Ball Z fights were among the most epic fights we had ever seen. It didn't matter how long Cell stood still transforming, when the fists started flying, the payoff was always worth it. And if I'm honest, I don't know if there are any fights in Dragon Ball that reach the same heights of the best fights we see in Dragon Ball Z. But in my opinion, that's a good thing, because it means the show was constantly moving forward. To wrap things up, I'll just say that after rewatching the series, Dragon Ball Z is still one of my favorite anime of all time. And after watching it side by side with the original Dragon Ball, I now have a new appreciation for the things it does well. It may be outclassed by some other anime stories, but the impact it had on me as a kid will never go away. Dragon Ball Z is the main reason I decided to learn Japanese, a decision I've never regretted. And on top of everything else I've said, Goku was a shining example that if you work hard and always push yourself to your limits, there's no way you can't win. Maybe he's not the best role model for being a father, but he's an inspiration nonetheless. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say for now, but before we get out of here, let me know your favorite Dragon Ball Z memories in the comments below. Also, remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.